When 66-year-old Susan Matthews cleared out her classroom for the final time, she left behind more than just lesson plans and dusty erasers. Hidden in her desk drawer was a key to a storage unit she'd been paying for secretly for 4 decades. Inside that unit waited 1,847 letters, one for every student she'd ever taught. But these weren't ordinary letters. They contained predictions, secrets, and truths that would change everything. What had Susan been planning all these years? And why was she so determined to deliver these letters personally, one by one, even if it took the rest of her life? Susan Matthews had always been different from other teachers, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Maybe it was the way she looked at her students, not just seeing who they were, but somehow glimpsing who they might become. Or perhaps it was her unusual habit of taking detailed notes about each child, filling notebooks with observations that went far beyond academic performance. But the real secret was something no one suspected. For 40 years, Susan had been writing letters to the future. Every September, as new faces filled her classroom, Susan would begin a ritual that had become as sacred to her as breathing. Within the first month of school, she would write a letter to each student, not to be read now, but decades later. Letters filled with observations, encouragements, and predictions about their potential. Letters that captured not just who they were at 8 or 10 or 12 years old, but who she believed they could become. But where had she been keeping all these letters? And more importantly, why? The answer to that question was about to turn a quiet retirement into the most important mission of Susan's life. The storage unit was located on the outskirts of Millfield, in a facility that most people drove past without noticing. Unit 247, tucked between a divorced man's motorcycle collection and a family's Christmas decorations, had been Susan's secret for longer than most of her colleagues had been teaching. Every month for 4 decades, she had made the 15-minute drive from her apartment, carrying a small box of carefully sealed envelopes. The unit wasn't large, just 10 feet by 12 feet, but it contained something more valuable than gold. 17 filing cabinets lined the walls, each one meticulously organized by year and alphabetically by student name. Every letter was stored in acid-free envelopes, protected from time and moisture. Every cabinet had a detailed index. Every file had backup copies stored separately. But Susan hadn't just been collecting these letters randomly. She had a plan that was finally ready to be executed. On her last day of teaching, Susan had made a list of every student she could remember, along with whatever information she could find about their current lives. Social media had made the task easier in recent years, but some students remained mysteries. Some had moved away. Some had changed their names. Some had simply vanished into the complexity of adult life. But Susan was determined to find them all. The first challenge was figuring out where to start. Should she begin with her earliest students, now in their 40s and 50s? Should she focus on those she knew were still in town? Should she start with the ones who needed encouragement most, or the ones who had already succeeded? But as Susan opened the first filing cabinet, she discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her own project. The letters in the 1982 cabinet, her very first year of teaching, were different from the others. The envelopes were yellowed with age, and Susan's handwriting was younger, more hurried. But there was something else. Several letters had been opened and resealed. Several had additional notes paper-clipped to them, written in handwriting that wasn't Susan's. Susan's hands trembled as she picked up the first altered letter. It was addressed to Tommy Rodriguez, a quiet boy who had struggled with reading. The original letter was there, in Susan's familiar script. But attached to it was a note in different handwriting, Tommy graduated from law school in 2003, became a public defender, married Maria Santos in 2005. 2 children, lives on Elm Street, still struggles with confidence. Letter will mean everything to him. Who had written this note? Susan had never shown these letters to anyone. She had never even mentioned the project to her closest friends. The storage unit was in her name only, paid for with her personal account. The only people who could have accessed it were. Susan checked the lock. No signs of forced entry. She checked the security logs. No record of anyone else entering the unit. But someone had clearly been here. Someone who knew about her students' adult lives. Someone who had been tracking them just as carefully as she had. Susan's mind raced through possibilities. Had another teacher discovered her secret? Had someone been following her all these years? Or was there something about this project that she had forgotten? The truth was hidden in the filing cabinet labeled 1985, and it would change everything Susan thought she knew about her 40-year mission. The 1985 cabinet contained the usual collection of letters, but it also contained something Susan had completely forgotten. A manila folder labeled the project Original Notes. Inside were documents in her own handwriting, but written in the precise, careful script of someone much younger. As Susan read, memories flooded back. The project hadn't started as her own idea. It had been suggested to her during her teacher training by Professor Emily Harrison, a legendary educator who had taught at the university for over 50 years. Professor Harrison had pulled Susan aside after a particularly challenging practicum day and said something that had stuck with her. The tragedy of teaching is that we never get to see the full story. We see the first chapters of these young lives, but we rarely learn how the story ends. What if there was a way to bridge that gap? Professor Harrison had suggested that Susan try an experiment. Write letters to her students' future selves, to be delivered when they were adults. Not just any letters, Professor Harrison had said. Letters that capture the essence of who they are when they're young. Their dreams, their fears, their unique spark. Store these letters away, and someday, when they're older and perhaps struggling with who they've become, give them back this reminder of who they once were. Susan had forgotten that Professor Harrison had given her a key to a storage unit as a graduation gift. A place to keep your treasures, she had said with a mysterious smile. But how had someone else been accessing the unit? Susan flipped through more pages and found her answer. Professor Harrison had kept a second key. What Susan discovered next would reveal that her beloved mentor had been keeping an even bigger secret. Tucked between her old notes was a business card she'd never seen before. The Future Foundation, connecting past and present through the power of memory. On the back was a handwritten note. Dear Susan, by the time you read this, you'll be ready to understand the truth about your project. Call this number when you're ready to learn about the others. The others? What others? Susan dialed the number with shaking hands. It rang 3 times before a warm voice answered. Future Foundation, this is Margaret speaking. Susan Matthews, I presume. We've been expecting your call. How did you? Professor Harrison left very detailed instructions. She knew you'd call on your retirement day, plus or minus a week. You're actually 3 days early. Margaret's voice carried a smile. She also predicted you'd be confused about the additional notes in your files. Would you like to come in for the full explanation? Susan's head was spinning. Professor Harrison died 15 years ago. Yes, she did. But she left very thorough plans for the continuation of the project. You weren't her only student, Susan. Over her 50-year career, she inspired 4 to 7 teachers to start similar projects. You're part of something much larger than you realized. Margaret gave Susan an address downtown, in a building Susan had walked past thousands of times but never really noticed. "Come whenever you're ready. And Susan, bring the first letter you want to deliver. You're going to need our help finding some of your students." But nothing could have prepared Susan for what she discovered when she walked through the doors of the future foundation. The building looked ordinary from the outside, a modest three-story brick structure sandwiched between a coffee shop and a bookstore. But the interior was extraordinary. The entire first floor was filled with filing cabinets, computers, and detailed charts covering every wall. Dozens of people worked quietly at desks, some typing, others organizing papers, others talking softly on phones. Margaret, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and knowing eyes, greeted Susan at the door. "Welcome to the Future Foundation. Professor Harrison's life work." "I don't understand," Susan said, looking around in amazement. "What is all this?" "This," Margaret said, gesturing to the busy room, "is what happens when 4 to 7 teachers spend 40 years writing letters to their students' future selves. We have over 7,000 to 5,000 letters waiting to be delivered." Susan's legs felt weak. 7,000 to 5,000. Professor Harrison believed that education's greatest failure was disconnection. We teach children, then lose track of them. We never get to see the impact of our work. We never get to remind adults of the dreams they once held. The Future Foundation exists to bridge that gap. Margaret led Susan to a wall covered with photographs. Hundreds of faces, all smiling, all holding letters. These are some of the people who have received their letters so far. Teachers like you, students who received unexpected reminders of their potential, families reunited with memories they thought were lost forever. Susan studied the photos. In each one, the person holding the letter looked transformed, surprised, emotional, deeply moved. "How do you find them all?" "That's the beautiful part," Margaret said. "We don't just find them. We wait for the right moment to deliver each letter." Professor Harrison called it divine timing. We research each person, follow their lives from a distance, and deliver their letter when they need it most. But Margaret's next revelation would show Susan that some letters had already been delivered, with results she never could have imagined. Margaret led Susan to a computer terminal. "Let me show you something that might surprise you. Do you remember a student named David Chen? You taught him in 1993. Susan nodded. David had been a brilliant but painfully shy boy who rarely spoke in class despite obviously understanding everything. Margaret pulled up a file on the computer. David received his letter 6 months ago. We delivered it on a very specific day, the day before he was scheduled to give his first TED Talk about innovative teaching methods. He was terrified, considering backing out. The screen showed a video clip of David, now a successful education researcher, standing on a TED stage. But first, he was saying to the audience, "I want to read you something. 6 months ago, I received a letter from my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Matthews. She wrote it when I was 9 years old, but I just received it now, 30 years later." David held up a familiar envelope. Susan's throat tightened as she recognized her own handwriting. In this letter, David continued, Mrs. Matthews wrote, "David, I see you watching the world with such careful, thoughtful eyes. I know you're shy about speaking up, but I want you to know that your thoughts matter. Someday, you're going to have important things to say, and the world will be ready to listen. Don't be afraid of your own voice. It has power you don't even realize yet." The TED audience was completely silent. David's voice grew stronger. "I was about to cancel this talk because I was afraid of my own voice. But my 9-year-old self, speaking through Mrs. Matthews' letter, reminded me that I had something worth saying. Susan watched through tears as David delivered what would become one of the most watched education talks in TED history. Over 3 million views and counting. "That's just one story," Margaret said softly. "We have hundreds like it." But what Margaret showed Susan next would reveal that not all the letter deliveries had gone according to plan. Margaret's expression grew more serious as she pulled up another file. "I need to show you something else, Susan. Not all of our interventions have positive outcomes. Professor Harrison insisted that we track every delivery, successful or otherwise." The file that appeared on screen was marked "Delivery Complications, Requires Special Handling." Susan scanned the list of names and stopped cold when she saw one that made her heart race. Jennifer Walsh, 1987 delivery, attempted 3 times, current status, unknown. "Jennifer," Susan whispered. She remembered Jennifer vividly, a bright, creative girl with an infectious laugh who had been in foster care. Jennifer had been one of Susan's most memorable students, but also one of her most heartbreaking. "What happened?" Margaret's fingers moved carefully across the keyboard. "Jennifer has had a difficult life. Multiple addresses, several name changes, some legal troubles. We've attempted to deliver her letter 3 times over the past 5 years, but each time, something has prevented it." "What kind of complications?" "The first attempt was in 2018. Our delivery team found her address, but she had just been evicted. The second attempt was in 2020. She was in court-ordered rehabilitation. The third attempt was last year. She was..." Margaret paused. "She was in jail." Susan's heart broke. Jennifer had been such a bright light as a child. What was she arrested for? "Petty theft. Apparently, she's been homeless on and off for several years. Addiction issues." "But Susan," Margaret's voice grew more intense, "we believe your letter could be exactly what she needs right now. She was released 3 weeks ago and is staying at a halfway house downtown." Susan stared at the screen. "You want me to deliver it personally? We think it might be her last chance. The letter you wrote to Jennifer. Let me read you part of it." Margaret scrolled through the file. "You wrote, 'Jennifer, your smile could light up the darkest room. I've watched you help other children when they're sad, and I've seen you create beautiful art from nothing but scraps. You have a gift for bringing joy to others, even when your own life is difficult. Never forget that you matter, that you're loved, and that the world is a better place because you're in it." But when Susan agreed to deliver Jennifer's letter personally, she had no idea that this decision would put her on a collision course with a secret that threatened to destroy everything. The halfway house was located in a part of town Susan rarely visited. The brick building looked tired but clean, with small windows and a heavy front door. Susan sat in her car for 20 minutes, clutching Jennifer's letter, trying to work up the courage to go inside. What if Jennifer didn't remember her? What if the letter seemed silly or irrelevant after 35 years? What if it actually made things worse? Finally, Susan forced herself out of the car and approached the front desk. A young woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Sarah looked up expectantly. "I'm looking for Jennifer Walsh," Susan said, her voice barely steady. I was her teacher many years ago. I have something for her." Sarah's expression shifted slightly. "Jennifer isn't receiving visitors right now. She's been struggling with the transition back to civilian life. May I ask what this is regarding?" Susan held up the letter. "I wrote this to her when she was 12 years old. I've been waiting a long time to give it to her." Sarah studied the envelope, then looked more carefully at Susan. "You're a teacher." "Retired. Yesterday, actually." Something in Sarah's expression changed completely. "Wait here," she said, standing up abruptly. "Don't go anywhere. There's something you need to know." Sarah disappeared through a door marked private and returned 5 minutes later with an older woman who had the bearing of someone in charge. "Matthews," the older woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Director Patricia Washington. Sarah tells me you have a letter for Jennifer Walsh." "Yes, Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask you something very important. Have you been in contact with anyone else about Jennifer recently? Anyone asking questions about her past or her current situation?" Susan shook her head, confused. "No, just the Future Foundation. They told me where to find her." Director Washington and Sarah exchanged a meaningful look. "Matthews, we need to talk privately. Right now." What Director Washington revealed next would expose a conspiracy that went far deeper than Susan ever imagined. Director Washington led Susan to a small office and closed the door firmly. "Matthews, Jennifer Walsh died 3 days ago." Susan felt the world tilt. But the foundation said she was here, that she'd been released. "Jennifer was never here," Director Washington said gently but firmly. "She died of an overdose in Denver 3 days ago. We got the call from the police yesterday because this facility was listed as her emergency contact from a previous stay 5 years ago." Susan's mind reeled. But how did the foundation know she was here? They had detailed information about her release date, her current status. "That's what worries us," Sarah interjected. "Because you're the third person who has come here looking for Jennifer in the past month. All with the same story about letters from her childhood." Director Washington leaned forward. "Matthews, I need you to think very carefully. This foundation you mentioned, did they ask you to bring anything else? Any forms to sign? Any personal information about Jennifer or other students?" Susan thought back to her conversation with Margaret. "No, they just wanted me to deliver the letter. They said they had been tracking her for years, waiting for the right moment." "Tracking her," Director Washington repeated slowly. "Matthews, I think you may have been talking to people who aren't who they claim to be." Sarah pulled out a business card. "The other 2 people who came here left these cards. Is this the same organization you dealt with?" Susan looked at the card. It looked identical to the one she'd found in her files, but something was wrong. The address was different. The phone number was different. And the name was slightly altered, the Future Foundation instead of the Future Foundation. "Oh my God," Susan whispered. "I think I've made a terrible mistake." But the truth about the fake foundation was more sinister than Susan could have ever imagined. Director Washington immediately called the police. Within an hour, Detective Maria Santos was sitting in the same small office, taking detailed notes as Susan explained about the storage unit, the letters, and her meeting with Margaret. "Matthews," Detective Santos said, "I need you to understand that you may have been the target of a very sophisticated operation. We've been tracking a group that specializes in what we call emotional fraud, scams that target people's deepest feelings and memories." Susan felt sick. But they knew so much about my students. They had details about David Chen's TED Talk, information about Jennifer's life. Information that's publicly available if you know where to look, Detective Santos explained. TED Talks are online. Court records are public. Obituaries contain family details. Someone with enough time and computer skills could piece together quite a lot about someone's life. The detective pulled out a tablet and showed Susan a series of photographs. "Do you recognize any of these people?" Susan scrolled through the images and stopped at the third one. "That's Margaret, the woman I spoke with at the foundation." Her real name is Margaret Reeves. She's been running variations of this scam for over 10 years. She targets retired teachers, therapists, social workers, people who have spent their careers caring about others and might have kept detailed records. Susan's hands were shaking. What do they want? My letters aren't worth anything. It's not about the letters themselves, Detective Santos said. It's about the information in them. Names, family details, personality assessments, predictions about future careers. That kind of data is incredibly valuable to identity thieves, insurance scammers, and people running long-term cons. Director Washington nodded grimly. They probably hope to get access to all of your files, copy everything, and then use that information to target your former students with personalized scams years down the road. Susan thought about the storage unit, the 17 filing cabinets, the thousands of letters containing intimate details about children who were now adults. I have to stop them. They might still be planning to. Detective Santos held up her hand. Matthews, we need you to do exactly what we tell you. Because right now, you're our best chance of catching them. What the detective asked Susan to do next would require her to return to the fake foundation and put herself in serious danger. The plan was risky but simple. Susan would return to the foundation the next day, wearing a wire and accompanied by undercover officers. She would pretend that everything was normal and ask to see more of their operation, hoping to gather evidence of the scam. The important thing, Detective Santos emphasized, is that you act natural. Don't let them know you suspect anything. Ask to see more files, more success stories. Try to get them to show you their database or their tracking methods. Susan spent a sleepless night rehearsing what she would say. Part of her couldn't believe that Margaret, who had seemed so genuine, so caring, was actually a criminal. But another part of her was angry, furious that someone would exploit her life's work and target her students. The next morning, Susan returned to the building downtown. This time, she noticed things she had missed before. The coffee shop next door was closed, with newspaper covering the windows. The bookstore on the other side had a for lease sign. The building that had seemed so bustling with activity yesterday felt different today. Susan pushed open the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. The space was empty. Completely empty. No filing cabinets, no computers, no busy workers. Just empty rooms with faded rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung. A maintenance worker was sweeping in the corner. "Excuse me," Susan called to him. "What happened to the future foundation?" "They were here yesterday." The man looked confused. "Lady, this building's been empty for 3 months. Used to be a telemarketing company, but they moved out in the spring. Nobody's been here since then." Susan's blood ran cold. She pulled out her phone and called Detective Santos immediately. But what Susan discovered next would prove that the fake foundation had been planning this for much longer than anyone realized. Detective Santos arrived within minutes, along with a team of forensic specialists. As they examined the empty building, they found evidence that chilled everyone involved. "Matthews," Detective Santos called from the back room. "You need to see this." On the floor, partially hidden under some loose papers, was a detailed floor plan of the building. It showed exactly how the space had been configured yesterday, where each filing cabinet had been placed, where the computers had been positioned, even where the photographs had been hung on the walls. But the most disturbing part was the timeline written in the margin. The plan was dated 6 months ago. At the top in neat handwriting were the words, "Susan Matthews retirement date, December 15. Estimated response time, 23 days. Extraction date, December 18. They knew exactly when you would retire, Detective Santos said grimly. They've been planning this operation for months, maybe years. A forensics technician called from another room. Detective, you need to see this. In what had been the main workspace, they found dozens of empty file folders labeled with names Susan recognized, her former students. Each folder had a tab with a name and a year, organized exactly like Susan's own filing system. They weren't just running a scam, Detective Santos realized. They were building a complete database of your students. They probably planned to disappear yesterday and then spend years using this information for targeted fraud. Susan picked up one of the empty folders. The name on the tab was Tommy Rodriguez, the same student whose letter had shown signs of tampering in her storage unit. Detective, I think they may have been planning this for much longer than 6 months. I think they've been accessing my storage unit for years. The truth about how long the scammers had been watching Susan would shock everyone and reveal a betrayal that cut to the heart of her teaching career. The storage facility manager, a nervous man named Dave, met them at Unit 247 with a thick file of access records. I've been going through our logs like you asked, he told Detective Santos. There's definitely something weird here. Susan watched as Dave spread computer printouts across a folding table. Matthews, you've been renting this unit for 40 years, right? Always paid on time, always accessed it alone. Yes, except for the first few years when Professor Harrison had a key too. But she died 15 years ago. Dave ran his finger down a long list of dates and times. According to our electronic logs, someone with a key has been accessing this unit regularly for the past 5 years. Always on weekdays, always during school hours when you would have been teaching. Detective Santos leaned closer. How is that possible? Matthews, did you give anyone else a key? No, never. I was very careful about keeping this secret. Dave pulled out another sheet. Here's the strange part. The access pattern is very regular. Third Thursday of every month, always between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Whoever was coming here was following a schedule. Susan's mind raced. Third Thursday of every month during school hours. That's the day I always had parent-teacher conferences, she realized. I would be at school from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. Everyone at school knew I wouldn't be available those days. Detective Santos and Dave exchanged glances. Matthews, this suggests that whoever was accessing your unit knew your schedule intimately. Someone who knew your work routine, your habits, your commitments. Susan felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying it was someone from school. We need to check something, Detective Santos said. Dave, can you pull up the access logs for the day Mrs. Matthews visited 2 days ago? I want to see exactly when she was here and when she left. Dave typed on his computer and frowned. That's interesting. Matthews accessed the unit at 2:15 p.m. and left at 3:45 p.m. But according to this, someone else accessed the unit at 5:30 p.m. the same day. Impossible, Susan said. I was the only one there. I locked up and left. Detective Santos was already on her phone. I need a forensics team at Millfield Storage, Unit 247, immediately. And I need surveillance footage from December 15th, both afternoon and evening. What the surveillance footage revealed would expose a betrayal so personal, so deeply rooted in Susan's professional life, that it would shake her faith in everything she thought she knew. The storage facility's security office was cramped and smelled like coffee and electronics. Susan sat between Detective Santos and Dave, watching as the security guard queued up the footage from 2 days ago. Here's you arriving at 2:15, the guard said, pointing to the black and white monitor. Susan watched herself park, unlock the unit, and disappear inside. Fast forward to when she leaves, Detective Santos instructed. The footage jumped ahead. Susan watched herself lock the unit and drive away at 3:47 p.m. Now show us 5:30, the detective said. The guard fast-forwarded again. At 5:28 p.m., a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Susan's heart stopped as she watched a figure get out of the car and walk directly to Unit 247. It was Principal Robert Hayes, her principal for the past 15 years. "I don't understand," Susan whispered as they watched Principal Hayes unlock her unit with his own key and disappear inside. "How does he have a key? How long has he keep watching?" Detective Santos said grimly. Principal Hayes emerged from the unit 22 minutes later, carrying a small box. He locked the unit, looked around carefully to make sure no one was watching, and drove away. "Matthews," Detective Santos said, "how well do you know Principal Hayes?" Susan's mind was reeling. "I've worked for him for 15 years. He hired me when I transferred to Millfield Elementary. He's always been supportive, always." Susan stopped. "He was the one who suggested I take early retirement." "What do you mean?" "Last month, he called me into his office and said that the school district was offering an attractive early retirement package. He said I qualified and that it might be a good time to consider it, given my age and years of service. He even offered to help me fill out the paperwork." Detective Santos was taking notes rapidly. "Did he seem eager for you to retire?" Susan thought back to the conversation. "Actually, yes. He kept emphasizing that the offer was time-limited, that I needed to decide quickly. And he asked a lot of questions about my personal plans after retirement." The security guard had been following the conversation. "You want to see something really interesting? Let me show you how far back these visits go." He pulled up older footage, scanning through months of recordings. "Here's your principal in October. Here he is in September. August." The guard kept scrolling backwards through the files. "Matthews, this guy has been visiting your unit regularly for at least 3 years." But Principal Hayes' betrayal was only the beginning. What Susan learned next would reveal a conspiracy that went to the very top of the school system. Detective Santos immediately contacted the school district's main office and arranged an emergency meeting with Superintendent Jennifer Walsh, a different Jennifer Walsh than the deceased student, it turned out. Within 2 hours, Susan found herself in the superintendent's conference room, surrounded by district officials and law enforcement. "Matthews," Superintendent Walsh began, "we need you to understand that this investigation has implications far beyond your personal situation. If Principal Hayes has been involved in this scheme, we need to know how deep it goes." Detective Santos had been busy during the drive to the district office. "We've discovered some disturbing patterns," she reported. "In the past 5 years, Millfield Elementary has had an unusually high number of teachers take early retirement. 12 teachers in 5 years, all with 20-plus years of experience, all in their 50s and 60s. The superintendent looked troubled. "That does seem unusual, but perhaps Principal Hayes was just helping senior teachers understand their retirement options." Except, Detective Santos continued, "we contacted several of these retired teachers. 6 of them report that they've been approached in the past year by organizations offering to help them reconnect with former students. Organizations with names similar to Future Foundation." Susan felt sick. "He's been doing this to other teachers." "It appears so. We think Principal Hayes has been systematically targeting long-term teachers who might have detailed records of students, encouraging them to retire, and then connecting them with this scam operation." Superintendent Walsh was furious. Where is Principal Hayes now? I want him in this room immediately. The district's HR director, who had been quietly making phone calls, looked up with a pale face. Superintendent, we have a problem. Principal Hayes submitted his resignation yesterday, effective immediately. He cited a family emergency and said he was moving out of state. Detective Santos was already on her radio. I need an APB on Robert Hayes, approximately 55 years old, driving a blue Honda Accord. She rattled off his license plate number from memory. There's more, the HR director continued. His resignation letter came with a request to access the district's personnel files for transition purposes. He specifically asked for records of all teachers who had retired in the past 5 years. Susan realized with growing horror how carefully this had all been planned. He wasn't just targeting me. He was farming information from multiple teachers, building a database of thousands of former students. But just as the police were closing in on Principal Hayes, a phone call would reveal that the conspiracy reached even higher than anyone had imagined. Detective Santos' radio crackled to life as they sat in the superintendent's office. Detective Santos, we've got a development on the Robert Hayes case. Go ahead, she responded. Hayes' vehicle was found abandoned at the airport 2 hours ago. We checked with the airlines. He boarded a flight to Chicago this morning under his own name. Superintendent Walsh stood up abruptly. Chicago? Why would he go to Chicago? Detective Santos was about to respond when her phone rang. She answered and immediately put it on speaker. Detective Santos, this is Agent Patricia Coleman with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk about your investigation into the Future Foundation scam. Everyone in the room froze. Susan whispered, Detective Santos, your case intersects with a federal investigation we've been conducting for the past 18 months. The group you're tracking is part of a much larger operation that spans multiple states. Agent Coleman's voice was crisp and professional. The Future Foundation is a front for what we call educational data harvesting. They systematically target retired educators to gain access to decades of student information, which they then sell to identity thieves, insurance fraudsters, and other criminal organizations. Susan felt like she was going to be sick. How many teachers have they targeted? Across 12 states, we estimate approximately 200 teachers have been compromised. That represents potentially 100,000 former students whose personal information has been harvested and sold. The superintendent was furious. And you're just telling us this now? We've been working undercover for over a year, trying to identify the full scope of the operation. Matthew's case may be the break we've been waiting for, because she made contact with them just as they were executing what we believe is their exit strategy. Detective Santos leaned forward. Exit strategy? We think they've collected all the data they can from this region and are preparing to shut down and move their operation elsewhere. Principal Hayes boarding a flight to Chicago confirms our suspicions. Chicago is where we believe the main operation is based. Agent Coleman's voice grew more urgent. Matthews, we need your help. We want you to continue pretending that you believe the foundation is legitimate. We're going to set up a controlled operation to draw them back out. What Agent Coleman asked Susan to do next would put her at the center of the most dangerous undercover operation of her life. Matthews, Agent Coleman continued over the speaker. We believe the foundation will contact you again within the next 48 hours. They've invested too much time and effort in your case to simply abandon it. When they do, we need you to agree to whatever they propose. Susan's voice was barely a whisper. You want me to work with them, even knowing what they are? We want you to help us catch them. This organization has been operating for years, stealing the personal information of thousands of people and using it to destroy lives. They've been particularly targeting elderly former students, people who might be vulnerable to sophisticated scams based on their childhood memories. Superintendent Walsh looked alarmed. Agent Coleman, Mrs. Matthews is a 66-year-old retired teacher, not a trained operative. You can't ask her to. I understand your concern, Agent Coleman interrupted. But Mrs. Matthews is our only direct contact with this organization. Without her cooperation, they'll disappear and resurface somewhere else, targeting new victims. Detective Santos had been listening intently. What exactly would Mrs. Matthews need to do? When they contact her, and they will, she needs to express concern about the safety of her storage unit. She needs to suggest moving all her letters to a new, more secure location. We'll provide that location, and it will be under complete surveillance. Susan felt her hands trembling. You want to use my letters as bait. We want to catch them in the act of stealing decades of personal information from children who are now adults. Matthews, these people aren't just identity thieves. They're using childhood memories and teacher observations to create sophisticated psychological profiles. They're targeting your former students with personalized scams based on intimate details you recorded about them as children. The weight of this revelation hit Susan like a physical blow. My letters. I wrote about their family situations, their fears, their dreams, their personality traits. Exactly. Imagine a scammer calling one of your former students and saying, "Hi, this is from the Scholarship Foundation your fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Matthews recommended you for. She wrote that you were interested in marine biology and that your family was struggling financially. We have a grant that might interest you." Susan realized with horror how perfectly crafted such a scam would be. A former student would have no reason to doubt information that's specific and personal. But as Susan agreed to help with the FBI operation, none of them realized that the criminals were listening to every word. 3 hours later, Susan was back in her apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. The FBI had installed monitoring equipment on her phone and given her detailed instructions on what to say when the foundation contacted her again. She was supposed to act worried about the security of her storage unit, mention that she'd heard about break-ins in the area, and suggest that her letters might be safer in a more secure facility. The FBI would provide such a facility, one equipped with cameras and listening devices. Susan made herself a cup of tea and sat down to wait. She didn't have to wait long. Her phone rang at 8:47 p.m. The caller ID showed the same number she had called 2 days ago. "Hello, Mrs. Matthews. This is Margaret from the Future Foundation. I wanted to follow up on your visit yesterday and see how the Jennifer Walsh delivery went." Susan took a deep breath and followed her script. "Actually, Margaret, I'm concerned about something. When I went to deliver Jennifer's letter, I discovered that she had passed away. But more worryingly, the people at the halfway house said others had been asking about her recently." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm so sorry to hear about Jennifer's passing. As for the other inquiries, that's probably just coincidence. Social workers, case managers, that sort of thing." "Maybe," Susan said, trying to sound uncertain. "But it made me think about the security of my storage unit. I've been keeping those letters there for 40 years, and suddenly I'm worried about whether they're safe. What kind of concerns do you have?" Susan followed the script the FBI had given her. "Well, the facility seems old, and I've heard about break-ins in that area recently. Those letters represent 40 years of my life's work. if something happened to them. I understand completely, Margaret said, her voice full of sympathy. Actually, the foundation has a secure facility where several of our teachers store their collections. Much more secure than those commercial storage places. Would you like me to arrange a visit? That would be wonderful, Susan said, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. When would be convenient? How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll send you the address. And Mrs. Matthews, don't worry about moving the letters yourself. We have a specialized team that handles historical documents. They'll pack everything carefully and transport it safely. After Margaret hung up, Susan immediately called Agent Coleman. They took the bait, she reported. They want to move my letters tomorrow afternoon. Perfect, Agent Coleman said. Matthews, tomorrow we're going to end this operation once and for all. But what Susan didn't know was that Margaret had made another phone call immediately after hanging up. And the person she called was much closer than anyone imagined. The next morning brought a revelation that would turn the entire investigation upside down. Susan was awakened at 6 a.m. by her phone ringing. It was Detective Santos, and she sounded urgent. Matthews, we have a problem. Can you get to the police station immediately? What's wrong? I'll explain when you get here. But Mrs. Matthews, do not go anywhere else. Do not talk to anyone else, and do not answer your phone until you're here. Susan dressed quickly and drove to the police station, her mind racing with possibilities. What could have gone wrong? Had the FBI operation been compromised? Detective Santos met her at the front desk and immediately escorted her to a secure conference room where Agent Coleman was waiting with a grim expression. Matthews, Agent Coleman began, we've discovered that our investigation has been compromised from the beginning. Susan felt cold dread settle in her stomach. What do you mean? Last night, after you spoke with Margaret, we continued monitoring the phone line. We recorded 3 additional calls made from that number. The third call was to someone here in town. Someone who has been feeding information to the criminal organization. Detective Santos opened a file. Matthew, the call was made to Superintendent Jennifer Walsh. Susan felt like the room was spinning. The superintendent. But she seemed so concerned yesterday, so angry about Principal Hayes. We've been investigating the superintendent's background all night, Agent Coleman said. Her employment history, her financial records, her connections. Jennifer Walsh has been working with this organization for over 3 years. But how is that possible? She's the head of the school district. She has access to... Susan stopped as the full implication hit her. She has access to personnel records for every teacher in the district. She would know exactly which teachers were approaching retirement, which ones had been teaching for decades, which ones might have detailed student records. Agent Coleman nodded grimly. She's been the one identifying targets for Principal Hayes to recruit. And yesterday, when we brought you to the district office and discussed our entire investigation in front of her. She heard everything, Susan whispered. She knows about the FBI operation. She knows we're onto them. She knows about today's planned sting. Detective Santos was already on her radio. I need units dispatched to the storage facility immediately. And I want Superintendent Walsh brought in for questioning. Agent Coleman's phone buzzed. She answered and listened for a moment, her face growing darker. Matthews were too late. The storage facility manager just called. Someone with official-looking paperwork showed up an hour ago and removed everything from your unit. They had a court order, a fake one, but it looked legitimate enough to fool the facility manager. Susan felt 40 years of work, 40 years of memories, 40 years of carefully preserved connections to her students slipping away. They have all my letters. Not just your letters, Agent Coleman said. We've just received reports from 6 other storage facilities in the area. Units belonging to other retired teachers have been cleaned out in the past 12 hours. Matthews, they've taken everything. But the criminals had made one crucial mistake that would lead to their downfall. Despite their careful planning, the criminals had overlooked something important. As Agent Coleman explained to Susan, the FBI had been prepared for the possibility of a compromised operation. Matthews, yesterday when you visited your storage unit with us, we placed tracking devices in several of your filing cabinets. Small, nearly invisible GPS transmitters. Even if they moved your letters, we can track where they took them. Agent Coleman pulled out a tablet showing a map with several blinking dots. Right now, your letters, along with materials from the other teachers, are all at the same location. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Detective Santos was studying the map. That's an industrial area. Mostly empty buildings and abandoned factories. Perfect place to sort through stolen documents without being disturbed. The question, Agent Coleman continued, is whether we move now or wait. If we arrest them now, we get the local operation but might miss the bigger network. If we wait, we risk them moving everything again. Susan looked at the blinking dots on the screen, each one representing years of her life's work. Agent Coleman, what happens to my letters if you wait? What happens to all those memories and connections? I won't lie to you. If they've already started processing the information, some damage may be irreversible. But if we can catch them in the act of organizing and digitizing your records, we'll have evidence of exactly how they operate. Susan thought about all her former students, adults now with families, careers, lives they'd built. She thought about the potential damage that could be done with 40 years' worth of intimate childhood observations. We go now, she said firmly. Those letters contain information about people I cared about. I won't risk their safety for the sake of catching a few more criminals. Agent Coleman smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We're already mobilizing the tactical team. But as they prepared to move on the warehouse, Agent Coleman's phone rang again. She listened for a moment, then looked up with surprise. Matthews, we just got a call from someone claiming to be Professor Emily Harrison. She says she's been trying to reach you for days, and that there's something crucial you need to know about your storage unit. Susan felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. Professor Harrison died 15 years ago. The phone call from the supposedly dead professor would reveal the most shocking truth of all. Agent Coleman put the call on speaker. An elderly woman's voice, weak but clear, filled the room. Susan Matthews. My dear, I've been trying to reach you for days. I heard about the trouble with your letters. Susan could barely speak. Professor Harrison. But you died. I went to your funeral. No, my dear. I've been in a nursing home for the past 15 years, suffering from severe dementia. I've only recently regained enough clarity to understand what's been happening. The voice grew stronger, more urgent. Susan, I need to tell you something about the storage unit I gave you. Something I should have told you years ago. What do you mean? The storage unit was never meant to be a gift, Susan. It was part of an experiment, a research project on long-term educational outcomes. I was working with a team of researchers who wanted to study the accuracy of teacher predictions about student futures. Agent Coleman and Detective Santos exchanged glances. This was not what any of them had expected. Professor Harrison continued. We set up multiple teachers with storage units, encouraged them to write predictive letters about their students, and then tracked those students over time to see how accurate the predictions were. It was meant to be a legitimate educational study. Susan felt sick. You mean I've been part of an experiment for 40 years without knowing it? Yes, and I'm so sorry. But Susan, that's not the worst part. The research project was shut down 25 years ago when we discovered that one of our team members was selling the student information to commercial interests. We thought we had contained the damage, but apparently. Apparently what? Agent Coleman demanded. Apparently someone has been continuing the project illegally, using the original research framework to target teachers and harvest student data for criminal purposes. Professor Harrison's voice grew even more urgent. Susan, did you ever meet a young researcher named Robert Hayes? He was part of our original team. The room fell silent. Susan felt like she was going to faint. Principal Hayes was part of your research team 25 years ago. He was one of our most enthusiastic researchers. But he was also the one we suspected of selling information. We couldn't prove it, so we simply disbanded the project and hoped the problem would disappear. Agent Coleman was furiously taking notes. Professor Harrison, we need you to tell us everything you remember about this research project and everyone who was involved. There's something else, Professor Harrison said. The original storage facility, the one where Susan keeps her letters, it was never really rented to her. It was part of our research infrastructure. There were hidden cameras in every unit, hidden microphones. The researchers have been monitoring every teacher for decades. Susan realized with growing horror that her most private moments, her most personal thoughts about her students, had been recorded for 25 years. But Professor Harrison wasn't finished. And Susan, the key I gave you wasn't the only key to that unit. Every researcher on the project had master keys to all the units. If any of them are still alive, they could access your letters anytime they wanted. The revelation about the surveillance would lead to the discovery of something even more sinister. Agent Coleman immediately dispatched a team to the storage facility to search for hidden recording equipment. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. Matthews, Agent Coleman reported 2 hours later, your storage unit wasn't just monitored, it was a sophisticated data collection center. Hidden cameras, voice recorders, even equipment to scan and digitize documents. Susan felt violated in a way she had never experienced. You mean every time I went to add new letters, every time I read old ones, every private moment I spent with those memories was recorded and transmitted to an unknown location. We found evidence that this data collection has been going on for at least 15 years, probably longer. Detective Santos had been coordinating with the tactical team at the warehouse. Agent Coleman, we need to move now. The GPS trackers show that vehicles are leaving the warehouse. They're transporting the documents somewhere else. But wait, Susan said, a terrible thought occurring to her. If they've been recording me for years, if they have videos of me accessing my letters, reading them, organizing them. What are you thinking? Agent Coleman asked. They know exactly which letters are most important to me. They know which students I spent the most time thinking about. They know which letters contain the most sensitive information. Susan's voice grew more urgent. They've been studying me for years to figure out exactly how to manipulate me. Agent Coleman's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and her face went pale. Matthews, we just got another text from the number that's been contacting you. They want to meet with you tonight. Alone. They say they have something urgent to tell you about one of your former students. Susan read the message over Agent Coleman's shoulder. Mrs. Matthews, we have discovered that one of your students from 1995, Emily Rodriguez, is in serious danger. We need to meet with you tonight to discuss how your letter might save her life. Come alone to 1247 Industrial Road at 9 p.m. If you bring anyone or alert authorities, Emily will be hurt. It's a trap, Detective Santos said immediately. They're using your concern for your students to lure you into danger. But Susan was thinking about Emily Rodriguez, a shy, brilliant girl who had been one of her most promising students. What if it's not a trap? What if Emily really is in danger? Agent Coleman was already working on her tablet. Let me check on Emily Rodriguez. If she exists, if she's really in danger, we need to know. After a few minutes of searching, Agent Coleman looked up with a troubled expression. Matthews, Emily Rodriguez is real. She's 32 years old, works as a social worker in Chicago, and according to her social media accounts, she's been missing for 3 days. The truth about Emily's disappearance would reveal that the criminals had escalated far beyond simple fraud. Agent Coleman was on the phone with Chicago police within minutes. Detective Morrison, this is Agent Coleman with FBI Financial Crimes. I need information about a missing person case. Emily Rodriguez, 32, social worker. The conversation was brief but chilling. When Agent Coleman hung up, her expression was grim. Emily Rodriguez was reported missing by her roommate 3 days ago. She left for work Tuesday morning and never arrived. Her car was found abandoned near a storage facility on the south side of Chicago. Susan felt sick with fear and guilt. They kidnapped her because of me. Because of something I wrote about her when she was a child. We don't know that yet, Detective Santos said, but her voice lacked conviction. Agent Coleman's phone rang again. This time, she didn't put it on speaker. She listened for a few moments, then walked to the far side of the room to continue the conversation privately. When she returned, her face was ashen. Matthews, that was my supervisor. The Chicago field office has been investigating a series of kidnappings over the past 6 months. All victims are adults between 25 and 40. All victims were former students of teachers who participated in educational data harvesting schemes. You mean this has happened before? Susan could barely get the words out. Emily Rodriguez is the 7th victim. The pattern is always the same. The victim disappears, then their former teacher receives a message asking for a meeting to discuss the victim's safety. Detective Santos was already putting on her bulletproof vest. What happened to the other 6 victims? Agent Coleman hesitated before answering. 4 were released unharmed after their former teachers cooperated with demands for additional information. 2 were found dead. The room fell silent except for the sound of Susan's labored breathing. Matthews, Agent Coleman said gently, I need you to understand that this is no longer about fraud or identity theft. These people are holding Emily Rodriguez hostage, and they're using your emotional connection to her to force your cooperation. Susan stood up abruptly. Then I have to meet with them. I have to do whatever they want to save Emily. Absolutely not, Detective Santos said firmly. You're not trained for this kind of situation. You could end up getting both yourself and Emily killed. But Agent Coleman was looking thoughtful. Actually, Detective Santos, Mrs. Matthews might be our best option. If we can wire her properly, provide adequate backup, and control the situation. You want to send a 66-year-old retired teacher into a hostage situation. Detective Santos looked incredulous. I want to save Emily Rodriguez's life, Agent Coleman replied. And Mrs. Matthews might be the only person who can do that. Susan looked back and forth between the 2 law enforcement officers. What would I have to do? The plan Agent Coleman outlined would put Susan face to face with the mastermind behind the entire operation. The plan was complex and dangerous. Susan would go to the meeting location wearing sophisticated recording equipment and a tracking device. A SWAT team would be positioned within a 2-block radius, ready to move in on a moment's notice. Agent Coleman would monitor everything from a surveillance van. Matthews, Agent Coleman explained, "Your job is simple, keep them talking. Get them to reveal where Emily is being held, and get them to admit what they've been doing. Don't try to be heroic. Just get the information we need to save Emily and shut down their operation." As the sun set, Susan found herself driving toward the industrial district, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The address they had given her led to a dark, seemingly abandoned warehouse surrounded by empty lots and shuttered factories. Susan parked where instructed and walked toward the building. The front door was slightly ajar, with a faint light visible inside. "Matthews," a voice called from the darkness as she approached. "Please come in. We've been waiting for you." Susan pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warehouse was mostly empty, except for some folding chairs and tables arranged in the center of the space. Several people stood in the shadows, but she could only make out silhouettes. "Please sit down," the voice said. As Susan's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw a woman approach from the shadows. It was Margaret, the woman from the fake Future Foundation, but she looked different now, harder, more businesslike, less pretend-friendly. "Where is Emily?" Susan demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emily is safe, for now," Margaret replied. "Her continued safety depends on your cooperation." Another figure stepped out of the shadows, and Susan gasped. It was Principal Hayes. "Hello, Susan," he said with a cold smile. "I suppose you're wondering how all this started." Susan tried to remember Agent Coleman's instructions about keeping them talking. "I want to understand. You were part of Professor Harrison's research team, weren't you?" Principal Hayes laughed. Professor Harrison's team was amateur hour. "We realized early on that the real value wasn't in studying educational outcomes. It was in the data itself. Do you have any idea how much personal information teachers collect about their students over the years? But why kidnap Emily? Why escalate to violence?" Margaret answered, "Because teachers like you started getting suspicious. Because the FBI started investigating. Because we needed insurance to make sure our operation could continue." A third figure emerged from the shadows, and Susan felt her world tilt again. It was Superintendent Walsh. "Susan," the superintendent said, "you've caused us considerable trouble. We had a good thing going until you started asking questions." Susan realized she was surrounded by people she had trusted, people who had manipulated her for years. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" Principal Hayes asked. "The data harvesting." "About 15 years. But kidnapping your former students, that's a recent innovation, forced on us by your interference." But what they revealed next about their true plan would show that Emily's kidnapping was just the beginning. Superintendent Walsh moved closer, her voice taking on an almost casual tone that made her words even more chilling. "Susan, Emily Rodriguez is just the first. We've identified 4 to 7 of your former students who could be useful to us." Emily was chosen because she works in social services. She has access to databases full of vulnerable people we could target with our services. Susan felt her stomach drop. "You're going to make her help you target more victims." "If she cooperates," Margaret said with a shrug. "If not, well, there are 4 to 6 others we can try." Principal Hayes pulled out a tablet and showed Susan a list of names. She recognized everyone, former students who were now adults with careers, families, lives they'd built. Each of these people has access to something we need. Teachers, social workers, bank employees, government clerks. Your letters gave us detailed psychological profiles of each of them. We know exactly how to approach them, how to gain their trust, how to manipulate them. Susan realized with growing horror the scope of what they were planning. You're going to blackmail 4 to 7 people. We prefer to think of it as leveraged cooperation, Superintendent Walsh said. Most people will do remarkable things to protect the people they love. Margaret sat down across from Susan. Here's how this works, Susan. You're going to help us contact each of your former students. You're going to arrange meetings with them, one by one. You're going to help us gain their trust. And if I refuse, then Emily Rodriguez dies, Principal Hayes said matter-of-factly. And then we move on to the next name on the list. Eventually, you'll cooperate, or we'll run out of leverage. Either way, we get what we need. Susan looked around the warehouse, desperately hoping that the FBI surveillance equipment was working, that Agent Coleman and the SWAT team could hear everything that was being said. But Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. Oh, Susan, you don't think we didn't check for recording devices? We've been monitoring law enforcement communications all day. We know about Agent Coleman. We know about the tracking devices in your letters. We know about the tactical team positioned around this building. Susan's blood ran cold. How is that possible? Superintendent Walsh smiled. Susan, we've been inside the education system for years. We have contacts in law enforcement, in government, in federal agencies. How do you think we've been operating for so long without getting caught? But the criminals had overlooked one crucial detail that would bring their entire operation crashing down. What Margaret and the others didn't know was that Agent Coleman had anticipated the possibility of compromised communications. The tracking device Susan wore wasn't connected to FBI radio frequencies. It was linked to a completely separate emergency network operated by the Department of Homeland Security. As the criminals continued outlining their plan, DHS agents were already moving into position around the warehouse, using communication channels that the criminal organization couldn't monitor. Susan, Margaret continued, we're going to start with Emily's release. But first, you're going to call 3 of your former students and arrange meetings for next week. We'll give you a script to follow. What kind of meetings? Reunion meetings, Principal Hayes said. You'll tell them you're organizing a special reunion for your favorite students. They'll come because they trust you, because you were important to them as children. Susan felt sick at the thought of using her students' affection for her to lead them into danger. I won't do it. Then Emily dies tonight, Margaret said simply. She pulled out a phone and dialed a number. Hello. Yes, it's me. Matthews is being uncooperative. Please proceed with phase 2. Susan could hear a voice on the other end of the phone, but couldn't make out the words. Margaret listened for a moment, then looked at Susan with fake sympathy. Emily just lost a finger. She's asking for you specifically. She wants to know why her favorite teacher won't help save her life. Susan felt tears streaming down her face. You're monsters. We're business people, Superintendent Walsh corrected. This is about supply and demand. We supply information and services to people who demand them. Your students are just resources in that equation. Principal Hayes handed Susan a phone. Call David Chen first. He's an education researcher now. He'll have access to databases full of teachers and students. Tell him you want to arrange a surprise reunion for your 1993 class. Susan stared at the phone, knowing that whatever choice she made, people she cared about were going to be hurt. But just as she was about to take the phone, the warehouse lights suddenly blazed to life. Powerful voices shouted from multiple directions. FBI. Homeland Security. Everyone on the ground now. The warehouse erupted in chaos. Margaret, Principal Hayes, and Superintendent Walsh scattered in different directions, but there was nowhere to run. The building was surrounded. Susan dropped to the ground as instructed, covering her head as armed agents swarmed the warehouse. But even as the criminals were arrested, the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Within minutes, Margaret, Principal Hayes, and Superintendent Walsh were in handcuffs. Agent Coleman rushed to Susan's side to make sure she was unharmed. "Matthews, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine, but Emily, they said they hurt Emily. They said she lost a finger." Agent Coleman was already on her radio. "Chicago team, we need an immediate update on the Emily Rodriguez situation." The response crackled back almost immediately. "Emily Rodriguez located and secured. She's alive and unharmed. Repeat, victim is alive and unharmed." Susan felt weak with relief. "But they said they were lying," Agent Coleman explained. "It's a common psychological manipulation tactic. Make you think the victim is being hurt to increase your willingness to cooperate." As the arrested criminals were being led away, Margaret turned back to Susan with a venomous expression. "You have no idea what you've done, old woman. This operation extends far beyond what you can imagine. We're just 3 people in a network of hundreds." Agent Coleman stepped between them. "Save it for your lawyer." But as Margaret was being pushed toward the exit, she called out one more thing. "Susan, ask them about the other teachers. Ask them how many other storage units they've found. Ask them how many other Emily Rodriguez's are still missing." Agent Coleman's radio crackled again. "Agent Coleman, this is Chicago Command. We need to talk. We've found evidence of 17 more kidnapping victims across 7 states. All former students of compromised teachers." Susan felt the warehouse spinning around her. 17 more people are missing. "Matthews," Agent Coleman said grimly, "I'm afraid this investigation is just beginning. The scope of the criminal network would prove to be larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined." Over the next several hours, as Susan sat in a police station conference room, the true extent of the criminal operation began to emerge. Agent Coleman briefed her on what they were discovering. "Matthews, based on evidence seized from the warehouse and information from the arrested suspects, we've identified a network spanning 12 states and involving over 300 retired teachers." Susan could barely process the numbers. 300 teachers, all unwitting participants in what we're calling Operation Memory Lane. The criminals systematically identified teachers with long careers, detailed student records, and approaching retirement dates. They used various methods to gain access to the teachers' files and storage units. Detective Santos had joined them with updates from other agencies. FBI field offices in Chicago, Denver, Phoenix, and 6 other cities are conducting simultaneous raids right now. They're finding storage units, surveillance equipment, and databases containing information on thousands of former students. But the missing people, the kidnapped former students, are they all being rescued? Agent Coleman's expression was troubled. "We've located 14 of the 17 missing persons. All alive, all safe. But 3 are still unaccounted for." Susan felt a chill. "What about the others? Are there more kidnapping victims we don't know about?" "That's what we're trying to determine. The suspects aren't cooperating, and their records are encrypted. It could take weeks or months to decode all the information." Agent Coleman's phone rang. She answered and listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly serious. Matthews, she said after hanging up, there's something else. The raids in other cities have turned up evidence that this network wasn't just collecting information about former students. They were also targeting the teachers themselves. What do you mean? Financial records, medical information, family details, retirement accounts. They've been building comprehensive profiles of every teacher in their network. We think they were planning something much larger than what we've seen so far. Detective Santos was reading from a report on her tablet. According to preliminary analysis of seized documents, they had detailed plans for targeting teachers' retirement savings, Social Security benefits, and pension funds. Susan realized that she and hundreds of other teachers had been victims in ways they were only beginning to understand. How long would this have gone on if we hadn't caught them? Based on their business plans, Agent Coleman said, they were projecting a 10-year operation with potential profits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The conference room door opened, and a new agent entered, a woman in her 40s with a serious expression and a briefcase full of documents. Agent Coleman. I'm Agent Sarah Martinez from the Department of Education's Inspector General Office. We need to discuss the implications of this case for the entire public education system. What Agent Martinez revealed would expose vulnerabilities in the education system that threatened millions of people. Agent Martinez opened her briefcase and spread documents across the conference table. Matthews, what you've uncovered isn't just a criminal conspiracy. It's a systemic vulnerability that affects every public school district in the country. Susan looked at the documents, many of which contained charts and graphs she didn't understand. I don't follow. Every teacher in every school collects detailed personal information about their students. Academic records, family situations, behavioral observations, health information. Most of this data is stored informally, in teachers' personal files, lesson plan books, grade books, storage units like yours. Agent Martinez pointed to a chart showing hundreds of school districts. There's no standardized system for protecting this informal data when teachers retire. No protocols for securing personal observations, no requirements for destroying sensitive information, no oversight of what teachers do with decades of student records. Agent Coleman was studying the documents. You're saying this vulnerability exists in every school district? Potentially, yes. We estimate that there are approximately 50,000 teachers retiring each year, many with 20-30 years of detailed records about students who are now adults. If criminal organizations can systematically target even a fraction of these retiring teachers, Susan felt overwhelmed by the implications. You mean there could be hundreds of operations like this one? We're already finding evidence of that, Agent Martinez said. In the past 48 hours, since news of your case started spreading through law enforcement channels, we've received reports of similar schemes in 15 states. Agent Coleman's radio crackled with an urgent message. Agent Coleman, this is command. We need you to respond to a situation in Milwaukee immediately. Local police have discovered what appears to be another storage facility operation. Agent Martinez gathered her documents. Matthews, we're going to need your help as we investigate the scope of this problem. Your experience and insights could be crucial in identifying other vulnerable teachers. But before Susan could respond, Detective Santos' phone rang. She answered and immediately put it on speaker. Detective Santos, this is Officer Williams in Chicago. We've got a situation. The 3 missing victims we hadn't found. We just discovered they weren't kidnapped. Everyone in the room froze. What do you mean? Agent Coleman asked. They're not victims. They're part of the operation. All 3 missing persons are working with the criminal network. They've been helping identify and target other former classmates. Susan felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. You mean some of my former students are part of this? It gets worse, Officer Williams continued. We found evidence that these 3 individuals have been actively recruiting other former students to join the network. They're using their shared history with their former classmates to gain trust and access. The final revelation would show that the conspiracy had evolved beyond anything anyone could have predicted. As the full scope of the operation became clear over the following days, Susan found herself at the center of a nationwide investigation that would reshape how America thought about education data security. The true mastermind behind the entire operation was someone Susan never could have suspected. 3 days after the warehouse arrests, Susan was called back to FBI headquarters for what Agent Coleman described as a crucial identification. They led her to an observation room with a one-way mirror. Matthews, we've arrested someone we believe is the actual leader of this network. We need you to tell us if you recognize this person. Through the mirror, Susan saw a woman in her 70s sitting calmly at a metal table. She had silver hair, kind eyes, and a familiar smile that made Susan's heart stop. That's impossible, Susan whispered. Do you recognize her? That's Professor Emily Harrison. But she's supposed to be in a nursing home with dementia. She called me 3 days ago. Agent Coleman's expression was grim. Matthews, the woman you're looking at has been running this operation for over 20 years. Professor Emily Harrison never had dementia. She faked her own cognitive decline and has been living under assumed identities while orchestrating the largest educational data theft in American history. Susan slumped against the wall. But she was my mentor. She inspired me to become a teacher. She's the one who suggested the letter project in the first place. Exactly. She's been playing a very long game, Mrs. Matthews. She identified promising student teachers, inspired them to collect detailed data on their students, provided them with storage facilities, and then monitored them for decades, waiting for the right moment to harvest 40 years' worth of information. Through the mirror, Susan watched Professor Harrison smile and wave, as if she knew Susan was watching. Agent Coleman handed Susan a thick file. She wants to talk to you. She says she has something important to tell you about your letters, something that will make everything clear. 20 minutes later, Susan sat across from Professor Harrison in an interview room, surrounded by federal agents and recording equipment. Her former mentor looked exactly as she remembered, warm, intelligent, caring. It was deeply unsettling. Susan, my dear, Professor Harrison said, her voice carrying the same warmth it had 40 years ago. I'm so proud of what you accomplished. 40 years of detailed observations, 1,847 letters, meticulous record-keeping. You were one of my most successful projects. Susan's voice was barely a whisper. Oh yes. I've been running variations of this experiment for nearly 50 years. You were part of Cohort 7, teachers who began their careers between 1975 and 1985. I've had 12 cohorts total, involving over 800 teachers across the country. Professor Harrison leaned forward conspiratorially. Susan, do you realize what you helped create? The most comprehensive psychological and social database of American families ever assembled. Your letters alone contain intimate details about nearly 2,000 families, their economic situations, their emotional dynamics, their secrets, their dreams. Susan felt physically ill. Those were private observations. I trusted you, and I treasured that trust. But Susan, think about the bigger picture. This information has been incredibly valuable for understanding social mobility, predicting career outcomes, identifying at-risk individuals. The research applications alone. Research. Agent Coleman interrupted. Professor Harrison, you've been selling this information to criminals. Professor Harrison looked genuinely hurt. Agent Coleman, you're thinking too small. Yes, some of our data has been used for what you might call commercial purposes. But we've also provided information to social services agencies, educational researchers, and policymakers. We've helped reunite families, identify people who needed assistance, predict and prevent social problems. She turned back to Susan. Your letter to David Chen, for example. We didn't just use it to manipulate him. We also used your observations to identify him as a potential educational innovator. We've been quietly supporting his career for years, ensuring he got the opportunities he needed to succeed. Susan stared at her former mentor. You've been manipulating his entire life. I prefer to think of it as guided development. We used your insights about his personality and potential to create opportunities that aligned with his natural abilities. His TED Talk, his research position, even his marriage, we helped orchestrate circumstances that allowed him to flourish. Agent Coleman was taking notes furiously. How many people's lives have you manipulated this way? Oh, thousands. Probably tens of thousands over the years. We've helped people find suitable careers, compatible spouses, appropriate educational opportunities. We've prevented some from making serious mistakes, guided others toward success. It's been quite remarkable, really. Professor Harrison's expression grew more serious. But Susan, that's not why I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to tell you about the letters themselves. The real reason I encouraged you to write them. Professor Harrison reached into a folder and pulled out a familiar envelope, one of Susan's original letters, but it looked different somehow. Susan, do you remember the special ink I gave you when you first started teaching? The ink that would preserve your words for decades. Susan nodded slowly. You said it was archival ink, designed for long-term storage. It was much more than that. It was experimental ink developed by a technology company I was working with. Ink that changes color over time in response to environmental conditions. Professor Harrison held up the letter under a special light, and Susan gasped. Additional text appeared on the paper, text that wasn't there when she wrote the letter 40 years ago. The ink responds to humidity, temperature, and chemical changes in the air. But more importantly, it responds to specific electromagnetic frequencies. We've been able to add information to your letters over the years, updating them with new data about your students as their lives unfolded. Susan felt like she was in a nightmare. You've been changing my letters, enhancing them. When David Chen gave his TED Talk, text appeared on his letter documenting his success. When Jennifer Walsh died, her letter updated to reflect that information. When Emily Rodriguez became a social worker, her letter grew to include details about her career path. Professor Harrison smiled with genuine pride. Your letters have become living documents, Susan. They've been growing and evolving along with your students' lives. They're not just snapshots of who these children were. They're complete biographies of who they became. Agent Coleman leaned forward. And you've been using this updated information for your criminal activities. Criminal is such a harsh word, Agent Coleman. We've been using this information to understand human development in ways that were never possible before. The applications for education, for social policy, for understanding how childhood experiences shape adult outcomes, it's revolutionary. Susan looked at the letter in Professor Harrison's hands, watching as new text continued to appear under the special light. How many of my letters have you altered? All of them, my dear. Every single letter you've written has been enhanced with updated information. Your storage unit wasn't just storing your memories. It was housing the most comprehensive longitudinal study of human development ever conducted. Professor Harrison's expression grew softer, more nostalgic. Susan, you've contributed to something truly historic. Generations of researchers will study the data you helped collect. Your observations about these children, combined with decades of follow-up information, represent an unprecedented window into how human beings grow and change over time. But the kidnappings, the fraud, the manipulation of people's lives, unfortunate side effects of a much larger and more important mission, Professor Harrison said dismissively. Susan, we've been conducting the most ambitious social science experiment in history. A few individuals being inconvenienced along the way is a small price to pay for the knowledge we've gained. As Professor Harrison spoke, Agent Coleman noticed something that made her heart race. The woman was wearing a small device on her wrist that looked like a medical alert bracelet, but it was blinking with a pattern Agent Coleman recognized from her technology training. Professor Harrison, Agent Coleman said carefully, "What is that device you're wearing?" Professor Harrison looked down at her wrist with a smile. "Oh, this. It's quite clever, actually. It's been recording everything we've said in this room and transmitting it to servers located in 12 different countries." Agent Coleman jumped up and immediately called for a technical team, but Professor Harrison continued talking calmly. "You see, the beauty of a truly long-term operation is that you plan for every contingency. Even if this phase of the project is ending, the data lives on. The servers, the databases, the decades of accumulated information, it's all safely stored beyond your reach." She looked directly at Susan. "And Susan, my dear, you're going to help us retrieve it." "What do you mean?" "You're the only person who has legitimate access to all the original letters. You're the only one who can claim ownership of the data and request its return from international servers. You're going to help us because the alternative is that thousands of your former students will have their most intimate information sold to the highest bidder on the dark web." Agent Coleman was frantically coordinating with technical specialists, but Professor Harrison seemed unconcerned. "I have a simple proposition, Susan. Help us maintain control of the data, and we'll continue using it responsibly for research purposes. Refuse, and we'll release everything to criminal organizations worldwide. Your choice." The final phase of the investigation took 6 months and involved law enforcement agencies from 17 countries. Susan found herself testifying before Congress, consulting with international cybercrime units, and working with education policy experts to prevent similar operations in the future. Professor Harrison's network was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Over 50 years, she had recruited nearly 1,000 teachers to unknowingly participate in data collection efforts. The criminal organization had files on over 100,000 American families, spanning 3 generations in some cases. The international servers were eventually located and secured, but not before significant amounts of data had been accessed by unknown parties. The full impact of the breach would take years to assess. Emily Rodriguez and the other kidnapping victims recovered physically, but many struggled with the psychological impact of learning that their entire lives had been monitored and manipulated based on observations made when they were children. Susan's letters, the original unaltered versions, were eventually returned to her. She spent months reading through them, trying to separate her genuine memories from the fabricated enhancements that had been added over the years. 1 year after the investigation concluded, Susan stood in front of a congressional committee tasked with developing new privacy protections for educational data. "Senators," she said, "I spent 40 years collecting information about my students because I cared about them. I wanted to preserve memories of who they were as children so I could remind them of their potential when they were adults." Susan held up one of her original letters. "But I learned that good intentions are not enough to protect the people we care about. When we collect personal information, even with the best of motives, we create opportunities for that information to be misused." She looked around the room at the senators, education officials, and technology experts who had gathered to hear her testimony. "The children I taught are adults now. They have children of their own. And somewhere in the world, in databases I can't access and servers I can't control, intimate details about their childhood, fears, and dreams are still being bought and sold." Susan's voice grew stronger. "We need laws that protect not just current students, but the adults they will become. We need systems that ensure teachers' observations remain private. And we need to remember that every piece of information we collect about a child will follow them for the rest of their lives." After her testimony, Susan drove back to her small apartment. Boxes of her letters, the real ones, written in ordinary ink with ordinary intentions, sat stacked in her living room. She had decided to do what she should have done 40 years ago, deliver them personally to her former students, not as part of any grand plan or social experiment, but simply as gifts from a teacher who had cared about them and wanted them to know they had mattered. The first letter she delivered was to David Chen. When she knocked on his door and handed him the envelope with his name written in her familiar handwriting, he cried. "Matthews," he said, "I've been waiting my whole life for this." Susan smiled, finally understanding that the true value of her letters had never been in the data they contained or the research they might enable. It was in the simple human connection between a teacher and her students, a connection that could survive 40 years of time and all the manipulation in the world. As she walked back to her car, Susan realized that Professor Harrison had been wrong about one crucial thing. The most important lesson wasn't in the vast databases, or the longitudinal studies, or the comprehensive analyses of human development. The most important lesson was that every child deserves to be seen, to be valued, and to be remembered for who they truly are. And sometimes the greatest gift a teacher can give is simply to tell a former student, "I saw the person you could become, and I was right."